I think by now you should have the handouts that are available, and you're thinking, what in the world is this guy thinking? Right after lunch, Supreme Court cases, 5 pages, front and back. Well, if you go to sleep, I'm going to start throwing stuff. That's all I'm going to say. My 7th grade Texas history professor used to turn his Texas A&M ring, you can't do this anymore, upside down and honk your head when you dozed off. But anyhow, we're going to make this fun and exciting and perhaps even informative. There's a special friend I wanted to point out of mine. We've been friends a long time, Dr. Morris Baker, distinguished professor from McMurray University, and now retired. And so we're really glad that you're here as well. This is going to be a significant shift of gears because we're looking at the macro now. We're looking at the United States of America primarily. Now you could do this with global things or regional. We're looking at the U.S. and what is happening, and then I'll tell you where we're going. What are the implications for those of us in congregations? Now, I realize I am wading into really tough stuff, and I can get in trouble with a single sentence because we have people of all political parties in the room and various shades in between, and of no political parties. We have some Lipscomites in the room, pacifists. We have some veterans in the room. And Lord willing, if you don't find each other by the next hour, I'll be thankful to God. It's kind of like the guy that was violently opposed to war. But I want you to pull above what we're doing here in a way and say, okay, what are some discernible themes? Where is all this going? How is it changing? On the bottom, I've started a legend that I think I kept about 95% of the time. If what I'm talking about is a presidential order, and by the way, there are a number of them, you got the square, and then the little arrow thing for Supreme Court decisions. The blank circle for congressional action, that was purely accidental. That there wasn't anything in that one. And then the diamond for the constitutional amendment, and then I've woven in here some various outstanding historical events. This is very much a survey. You can't get past page 1 without saying, oh man, you left out this or this or this. So I'll admit that right up front. But I think history is important. Doug Foster and I think history is important. There are at least 2 of us in the room that think it is, because it will give us some really good indicators about what's ahead for us as a nation and also as a church and individual Christians. Look at, I just picked up around the pre-Civil War time. Look at how these cases begin to unfold. We know about the Dred Scott decision, it's already been talked about this morning. I just have it down there for your consideration. Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st of 63. December 6th of 1865, the 13th Amendment. In fact, notice you have 3 amendments in a row, 13th, 14th, 15th. And here is a tendency of those of us in the church. We've already talked about that among those of us who are white brothers and sisters. And that is, we tend to assume that the civil rights issue, and specifically racial issues, have been settled. And they've been settled in the courts. Therefore, there is no more problem. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind as we go through. If I stop right there after February 3rd, 1870, here's 3 constitutional amendments. Wouldn't you say, that's settled? But I love Johnson Stormont's sermon about a month ago over here. He said the 4 most famous words in the late night cable commercials. But wait, there's more. And so there is more here. Look at how many times, I'll go ahead and give you a clue, for the sake of time, how many times a Civil Rights Act is passed? You'd think maybe once or twice or three times. Here's one in March 1875. Skip down to 1896, May 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. Upheld a 1890 Louisiana statute mandating racially segregated but equal railroad cars. So equal protection really doesn't mean equal protection, it means equal protection within class. And what that gave rise to a number of what we know as the Jim Crow laws. February 12, 1909, the NAACP was founded, but I must have taken a long break or something because I skipped 30 or 40 years here that I probably should go back in the next edition here and put these in. But let me just run through them really quick. I left out 1901, where Booker T. Washington wrote Up From Slavery. I left out the Niagara Movement in 1905, W.B. Boyce, demanding immediate racial equality and opposing all laws that treated blacks as different from others. That actually led to the creation of the NAACP, which from its beginning has been a rather diverse organization. And then 1915, this is my favorite one, there was a Supreme Court ruling about, in Oklahoma, let me see if I can get the story straight. This is the original grandfather clause. The Oklahoma legislature had passed a law that basically said you have to be literate in order to vote. Now, that's despite all this stuff that's come before. But there is an exception. If you can't read or write, but you can prove your grandfather voted, I'm not making this up. Your grandfather voted, then you can vote. Well, what would that do to all the blacks in Oklahoma? Most of their grandparents were slaves. So it wipes out large groups of people. So that's the original grandfather clause. Then you have a number of race riots in 1919, particularly in Chicago. In June 1941, this is not on your paper, but President Roosevelt issued an executive order to set up the Fair Employment Practices Commission to assure non-discriminatory policies in federal hiring. And let's don't forget, in 1947, Jackie Robinson joined the Brooklyn Dodgers. And in 1948, President Truman issued another presidential order integrating the armed forces. Now we're going to pick up on page 2, about 1954. Now you begin to get into territory that is really the precursor to the decade of the 1960s. The Supreme Court unanimously rules in Brown v. Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, public schools segregation is unconstitutional. Now notice that date. What I didn't tell you earlier was I have decided to interject autobiographical things in here every once in a while to give you some sense of my own pilgrimage. 27th of August, 1955, Emmett Till was kidnapped, brutally beaten in Mississippi, shot, dumped in the Tallahatchie River, allegedly for whistling at a white woman. And then you have these two guys who are tried, they're arrested, they're tried by an all-male white jury and acquitted. And then in Look magazine, which was, at that time was a nationally syndicated magazine, they bragged about what they did. December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat in a bus in Montgomery, Alabama to a white passenger. You know about that. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., newly elected president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, was involved in that boycott, of course. And later, Ms. Parks was represented in court by Fred Gray. And I can't believe you might not know who Fred Gray is, but if you don't, check the footnote. And he's quite a Christian man. And then February 14th, 1957, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Some of the leaders of the Civil Rights Organization came together. They, over the decades, proved to be a major force. And then down to 1957, to Arkansas, Little Rock, specifically. Little Rock 9. And there's been some great documentaries about all of these, and so I'm just going to hit the top, and you can look them up if you would wish. That is just, when you watch that documentary, it's hard to believe that this happened in the country where you live. February 1st, 1960, 4 black university students from North Carolina, AT&T, began a sit-in at Woolworth, Greensboro, North Carolina. And that triggered a lot of protests throughout the country. 6 months later, they were served. March 6, 1960, President Kennedy issued Executive Order 10925 prohibiting discrimination in federal government hiring. My question is, wait a minute, wasn't that already done by FDR in 1941? You see, we keep going back, and one of my concluding points is we have a real hard time getting this right as a country as well as individuals. April 1960, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinated Committee, was founded. It was later taken over, so to speak, by 2 people that were more radical, Stokely Carmichael and H.R.F. Brown. And in May of 1960, I graduated from Temple High School, pretty well clueless about what was going on. Although I heard critical remarks, and therefore I echoed them. We've already talked about James Meredith a little bit this morning. President Kennedy sent 5,000 federal troops to contain the violence and riots. I just lumped all of our Church of Christ-related schools together there. We all didn't integrate at the same time, but I think it was most of them were in about a 3-4 year period. Do you know why ACU integrated? Because they had to show proof of integration in order to get a national science grant fund to build a science building.
Same with Lipscomb.
Same with Lipscomb.
They wanted federal funding to build a new high-rise.
So they had to sign a statement that they were fully integrated. Not our most shining moment. Okay, Medgar Evers is murdered. Notice the conviction date of De La Beckwith, 30 years later. August 28, 63, March on Washington. This is King's famous I Have a Dream speech. September of that same year, 4 young girls were killed when a bomb exploded at 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. Here's another constitutional amendment, January of 64. 24th Amendment abolished the poll tax, which originally had been instituted in 11 southern states, making it difficult for blacks to vote. Well, I thought the 15th Amendment guaranteed the right of all citizens to vote. We're having to go back and half-sold some of these things, aren't we? I'm still pretty clueless, but I got through school. In graduate school, I encountered Dr. Carl Spain. And I just refer to him there as the first white man who got my attention. Summer of 64, known as Freedom Summer. And I've listed there a number of events that happened, including some violent ones in Alabama. July 2nd, 64, page 4, President Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act of 1964. you will see in the movie Selma tomorrow night a controversial portion there about the portrayal of Lyndon Baines Johnson. And to make it more interesting, one of the, I'll call him Jerry Taylor, my friend, Dusty Rhodes, who would be here today. He's an 83-year-old attorney in town, civil rights attorney. He would be here, except he's out of the state. He's helped us out quite a bit. He was a young aide to Lyndon Johnson, so he says the Selma story all wrong. But anyhow, it would be an interesting little dialogue if he were here. But the Civil Rights Act is signed. On August 4th, 1964, the body of 3 civil rights workers found in Mississippi. Most of the time I list their names, even though for the sake of time, I'm not calling each one of them out, but I think these names are important. Notice that the murderers were arrested, incarcerated for several hours, released after dark, into the hands of the Ku Klux Klan who murdered them. February 21st, 1965, the time of Malcolm X. He's most famous for the quote there toward the end. He kind of gave a anti-thesis to King's nonviolent approach. March 1965, the Selma to Montgomery marches, including Bloody Sunday. Actually, there were 3 marches, and the movie does a good job delineating those. The first one is called Bloody Sunday, and I meant to mention a while ago that this whole story, this whole narrative is full of ironies, and here's one of them. Edmund Pettus Bridge. If you don't know who Edmund Pettus was, I'm helping you out down here. He's a former Confederate general, U.S. Senator and Grand Dragon of the Alabama Ku Klux Klan. Edmund Pettus Bridge now is a symbol of the Civil Rights Movement, which I think is really interesting. You've seen documentaries of what had happened there. The lawmen attacked the peaceful demonstrators, bitter clubs, tear gas, bullwhips. All 3 major networks, at the time there were only 3, interrupted their telecast to broadcast footage of this horrific incident. And the fact that that happened is probably a big catalyst for some other things that happened a little bit later on. Lots of demonstrators throughout America came to the rally call of Dr. Martin Luther King. So a number of them flew to Selma. He did try to prevent another outbreak of violence. The marchers tried to gain a court order that would prohibit police from interfering, but look what happened. Instead of issuing a court order, Federal District Court Judge Frank Menace Johnson issued a restraining order preventing the march from taking place until they could hold additional hearings later in the week. So they went to the bridge. King and other leaders knelt down, prayed, and then went back, much to the frustration of some. And that night was when the minister from the North was killed by white vigilantes. March 21st through 25th is basically the Selma to Montgomery march, distance of about 50 miles, about 25,000 people probably at its most, and this was under heavy guard, federal troops. August 10, Congress, it seemed like we've read this before every night, passed the Voting Rights Act. This is either the 3rd or 4th. I'm losing count. September 24th, 1965, another executive order, this time to enforce affirmative action for the first time, because he believed asserting civil rights laws was not enough to remedy discrimination. Seems as though that we have heard that before too. This one was aimed more at government contracts. June 12, 1967, a Virginia Supreme Court ruled prohibiting interracial marriage was unconstitutional. It was had been unlawful in 16 states. August 30th, 1967, the U.S. Senate confirms President Lyndon Johnson's appointment of Thurgood Marshall, first African-American justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. And I graduated from ACU, the Master of Divinity, the only church that was available just over the District of Columbia line in Silver Spring, Maryland. And it was an integrated church. I thought that was interesting in 1967. I was thrown big time into the civil rights struggle. And I owe a great debt to two preachers and a deacon. The first two are preachers. Junius Stevens, Douglas Greer, and then Dick Brown, who was a deacon in my congregation. And they were pretty gentle with me. April 4th, 68, a day that none of us will ever forget, when Dr. King was assassinated. And so I'm in Washington, D.C., or just outside the district. My wife is running a nursery school for the 16th and Decatur Church of Christ. People began calling the nursing school saying, we're going to pick up our kid right now and get the kid ready. 4, 5, 6 times. Finally, she said, stop. What is going on? Because they did not know. Well, haven't you heard? Washington, Dr. King's been assassinated. Washington is burning and rioting. When I went to pick her up, you could see the smoke, and the burning and rioting stopped 4 blocks, actually about 6 blocks away from that church building. And here's what younger people do not believe. On entering the district, every day we passed U.S. soldiers for several weeks, holding machine guns and in riot gear and watching everything like crazy. Every time I went by, I had to pinch myself and say, this is the United States of America? Well, I was there. Okay, about ready for another Civil Rights Act. April 11, 1968. This had to do more with housing. 1971, Supreme Court upheld busing as a legitimate means for achieving integration in public schools, which, by the way, continued until the late 1990s. It did not do away with segregation, but it redistributed the population for a while. 72, I returned to Baylor, my PhD work. I took a church in South Dallas. I hadn't been in that church very long before I went home one day after an elders meeting and said, Pam, don't unpack all the boxes. I don't think we're going to be here long. I heard one of the elders bragging, he was a developer, bragging how he had figured out a way to keep blacks out of his subdivisions. And the other elders applauded him. And so what I do, I moved to Montgomery, Alabama, the epicenter of open thinking. See, I'm kind of like Jonah. I'm trying to run the other way, and Lord keeps sending me back to Nineveh. Anyhow, that was an amazing time. Amazing time. And the 78th Supreme Court, rather famous court decision, Lockheed versus Regents of the University of California. Here you begin to see the beginning of what we'll call reverse discrimination. Wait a minute, you've gone too far over this way to correct the problem. Now you need to come back this way. And so you begin to see things like this, cases like this come up. We moved to Springfield, Missouri. Total population of minorities in Springfield, Missouri, less than 2%. And by the way, that's still fairly well true today. It's still under 5. And then 81 moved here to ACU. And this is special to me. April '84, I accepted the position in the College of Biblical Studies, the faculty position, but not just any old position. It was the one Dr. Carl Spain had occupied. March 22nd, '88, Congress passed over the President's veto the Civil Rights Restoration Act. Seemed like we've had some Civil Rights Acts passed before. But this one reaches to private institutions receiving federal funds. Guess what, Christian college friends? That's us. November 12th, '91. Oh no, here's another one. The Civil Rights Act of 1991. In April 1992, the first race riots in decades erupted in south central Los Angeles after the beating of Rodney King. In 1998, several of us, some of you in this room here, began to talk about pulling together reconciliation conferences, just sitting down, talking with one another, and we labeled it One in Christ, which is an irony in itself. First meeting was October '98. These were kind of hand-picked leaders, Tony Roach and I. Where's Tony? Yeah, we kind of hand-picked him, didn't we, Tony? But I thought it was a good cross-section of predominantly black and white church leaders. And though it came to the end of the day, we were very convicted. Those of us in the room, I think everybody was. We got on our knees to pray. Who was the old brother that we had to help him up? I can't remember his name, but he said, "Somebody help me up." Said I had an unnamed black preacher came up to me and said, "I've never hugged a white man in my life, but I'm going to hug you." That was kind of neat. And it was Tony after I said, "What do we do next?" And Tony just said, "You could begin with an apology." You're pretty well aware of the rest of that. Except that it's kind of a sad note. In early 2003, by this time the reconciliation group had met twice. We couldn't meet in 9/11 year. Third meeting is being planned, and it began to disintegrate because of a variety of emerging differences, doctrinal, not racial, as it was explained to me. I don't buy it, but it was a can of worms. It was a tough one. And then nothing was really done, to my knowledge, other than isolated things, till Dr. Taylor began this series now. Moving on, we're getting into your discussion time. I'm not going to go through the rest of this, other than to say you begin to see around the 90s or 2000 a shift into a broader definition of civil rights. Homosexual, gay, lesbian, bisexual issues, feminist issues at times, all kinds of different issues. But notice on page 7, January 2008, guess what? Another Civil Rights Act. And but it's becoming increasingly broader now. It's interesting because some of the in the broadening out, some of the language and terminology is borrowed from the what I would call the original civil rights movement. And you go back and look at these cases. It just seems to me we haven't emphasized it here. But looking back, it's so interesting to me how many of these Supreme Court decisions are 5-4. That's interesting and a little bit frightening. What do we make of all of this? Because I want you to have some time to talk at your tables. Well, I think we just have a lot of trouble getting it right, and we're going to still be working on it. One of the things I wanted to say that hasn't really been said today. We've talked about individual, person on person. We've talked about congregation, helping different congregations. What I'm talking about is the big umbrella under which we all live, and that's the United States of America. And I hold up and honor people who are willing to get involved in public service and are willing to try one more time to get it right. And you can be cynical about politicians, and I can out-cynical any of you on it, but the bottom line is they do perform a great service. And the same laws we're talking about here are the laws that we're going to uphold over time, I hope and I pray, to take care of some of the violations that we talked about earlier in the day. And so I am an optimist. I'm not a pessimist when it comes to that. But it's really interesting to me because there's not much conversation in churches of Christ about what's going on politically. And we've kind of decided we're not going there. I'm not going there in a partisan way. I'm simply saying you have to be aware of what's happening because that can move the needle. And in fact, that can move the needle better and more than almost any other thing if it's done well, if it's done right, and the right people speak up and the right people get involved. Well, you can look at the rest of it. I'll just call your attention to one other thing before you are dismissed on your tables there to do your discussion. On page 9, number 5, how in the world, just scan down that list, can anybody in any of our congregations sit there and say, there is no problem? No. I've given you 4 questions for discussion. Turn at your table, or I'd rather you get in smaller groups if you want to, but find somebody, 2 or 3 other people, and talk about what you've heard, talk about some of these questions here, and if we have some chance, Don, or at the end, I'll just a couple of snippets of what some people have said. Thank you.